Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to be talking about something kind of creepy, something called 0 degrees of empathy. It's basically, about people who don't really get or share other people's feelings. And to help us unpack all of this, we're diving into this super interesting book about, the science of evil.
Yeah, it's wild, but the cool thing about this book is it's not just saying that, a lack of empathy automatically equals evil,
Right.
It actually goes deeper than that and, suggests there are different, types of folks who fall on this empathy spectrum or whatever. So, yeah, some definitely have these darker, tendencies, but some are actually surprisingly positive.
Okay, now you've really got me intrigued. That's, not what I was expecting at all. So where do we even start with something this, complex?
Let's start with the basics. The book calls it 0 degrees of empathy, which is basically, like I said, this inability to understand or even share what other people are feeling.
Yeah.
But it's not like a light switch,
Yeah.
it's more like a spectrum.
So it's not like you either have empathy or you're destined to become a supervillain.
Not at all. That's where the whole 0 negative and 0 positive thing comes in. The book kind of hints at these two categories from the beginning, and trust me, I was hooked. I had to know more.
Okay, let's maybe unpack this 0 negative side first.
Yeah.
I'm guessing this is where we find those people who might do harmful stuff.
Exactly. The book actually talks about 3 different types of these 0 negative people that it came across in some earlier chapters. But we don't have all the details on those just yet. What we do know is it makes it clear that low empathy usually comes from a mix of, nature and nurture. Especially those early childhood experiences. Those are really important.
So it's more complicated than just blaming a single empathy gene or whatever.
Way more complicated.
It sounds like a recipe, biology, environment all mixed together.
Yeah.
I remember this one story from the book about a kid with autism named Joe. Really stuck with me.
Yeah.
It was a perfect example of this.
Yeah, he punches a baby in an elevator, not because he's mean, but because he just doesn't get the social cues and why the baby's upset. It's really sad, honestly.
Yeah.
Shows how even unintentional lack of empathy can have real consequences.
Wow. That's got to be so tough for Joe and everyone around him. Makes you realize how important understanding and support are. But okay, I got to ask, how does this lack of empathy show up in those more, classic bad guy types? The book talks about a type P. Are we talking psychopaths here?
Yeah, psychopaths, or type P as the book calls them. But there's also type N for narcissists and type B for folks with borderline personality disorder. They all come with their own, challenges.
It's kind of scary to think about those types of personalities, but at the same time, trying to understand what's going on in their brains is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
The book mentions some research about, twins and adopted kids, right?
Yeah, really compelling studies, actually. They pretty much prove there's a genetic link to both, low empathy and antisocial behavior. So while, how you're raised and your environment are super important, our biology plays a role, too. But now let's shift gears a bit and talk about that 0 positive thing, the one you called a mind bender earlier.
Oh, yeah, please. This whole idea of having 0 degrees of empathy but somehow being positive is blowing my mind. Who are these people?
Okay, so this is where things get super interesting. We meet these people, especially folks with Asperger's syndrome, who are defying expectations. Imagine low empathy, but this incredible ability to systemize, to see patterns everywhere.
So it's almost like they trade empathy for super-powered pattern recognition. That's wild. Did the book have any real-life examples?
Tons. There's this guy, Michael, who has Asperger's, and he is totally obsessed with patterns. He finds them everywhere. Church bells, the golden ratio, you name it. His brain just sees order where others see, chaos.
Wait, hold up. Church bells. Tell me more about that.
It's not just about the sound. It's the patterns in math and how they ring. He breaks it all down and finds this symphony of numbers that most people would totally miss. And he's not the only one. The book has all these fascinating folks with Asperger's who have these crazy systemizing talents.
Okay, I'm hooked. What kind of talents are we talking about here?
Well, you've got Kevin, who tracks weather patterns in his garden like it's his job. Then there's Daniel Tammet, who memorized pi to, get this, 22,514 decimal places. And we can't forget Derek Paravicini, a blind musical savant.
Wow, that's insane. Okay, but how does this whole systemizing thing even work? What's happening in their brains?
So the book breaks it down into 2 main types. The first is systemizing by observation alone. You notice that every time you press a button, a light turns on. That's recognizing a simple pattern, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
What's the other type?
That's systemizing by observation and operation. Like you're messing around with, I don't know, different amounts of water and fertilizer to see how it affects your plants. You're not just watching, you're actively changing things to figure out the cause and effect.
So they're like mini scientists, always testing and tweaking to understand how things work. But I'm still not sure how this leads to, like, no empathy.
Okay, so here's the really interesting part. The book says that this need to systemize, this like craving for order and predictability, makes them not interested in stuff that's, messy and unlawful, and what's more unpredictable and chaotic than human emotions.
Ah, I get it. Emotions don't exactly follow, like, neat and tidy rules. That's got to be frustrating for someone whose brain thrives on logic and order.
Totally. Emotions can be like baffling and overwhelming for these folks, which makes it hard to connect with others emotionally. But remember, the book also talks about how genes play a role in empathy too. It's not just about how their brains are wired.
Right, that whole nature versus nurture thing we were talking about. Did the book get into specifics about which genes might be involved?
It did, and this is where it gets really exciting. It talks about the hunt for those, like empathy genes.
Hmm.
But it's not about finding one single gene. It's about understanding how our genes and environment work together to shape how much empathy we have.
So it's like our genes are the blueprint, but our experiences are like the contractor who decides how that blueprint gets built.
Exactly. The book says that certain genes might make someone more likely to have low empathy, but things like neglect during childhood are crucial in determining if that actually happens. It's a complex dance between nature and nurture.
It really highlights how much we still don't know about the brain and how it makes us who we are. I do remember the book talking about some specific genes, though, right?
Yeah. It mentions research linking the MAOA gene, the serotonin transporter gene, and the arginine vasopressin receptor 1A gene to things like aggression, recognizing emotions in others, and even how our amygdala, which is the emotional center of our brain, reacts to different things.
Oh, and so scientists are literally pinpointing the genes that are involved in empathy. That's mind-blowing. Didn't the book even mention a discovery from your own lab? Something about how we react to happy faces.
Oh, yeah. Our research focused on the cannabinoid receptor gene 1, or CNR1 for short. It basically influences how strongly our brain's reward system responds to happy faces. It's wild how much we enjoy seeing smiles is partly determined by our genes.
Okay, now that's just crazy. Our enjoyment of happy faces is, like, partially genetic. Tell me more.
We found that variations in the CNR1 gene affect how strongly the striatum, which is part of the brain's reward system, reacts to those happy faces. So depending on your genes, you might get more or less of a reward feeling from social interaction. It is really cool, actually.
Makes you wonder about all the subtle ways our genes influence how we connect? But how did the book's authors actually study all this? Did they just look at individual genes?
They use these questionnaires called the empathy quotient, or EQ, and the autism spectrum quotient, or AQ. These let them measure both empathy and autistic traits in a bunch of people and then link those traits back to specific genes. Pretty clever, huh?
That's really smart. So what did they find? Were there any obvious genetic links?
They actually found 4 genes, CYPB11B1, WFSI, NTRK1, and GABRB3, that were strongly linked to scores on that empathy quotient thing. This basically suggests that variations in these genes can influence how empathetic we are.
Wow, that's a huge discovery. And what about the autism spectrum quotient? Any connections there?
You bet. They found 4 other genes, NLGN4X, HOXA1, ARNT2, and MAO, that were linked to scores on the AQ. Shows there's a genetic influence on autistic traits too. And get this, they found 6 genes, ESR2, CYP78A1, CYP11B1, OXT, ARNT1, and HOX1, that were specifically associated with Asperger's syndrome.
Whoa, that's a lot of genes. It really shows how complicated these conditions are. Anything else stand out to you from those findings?
Oh yeah, one more thing. The same gene, CYP11B1, was linked to both empathy and Asperger's syndrome. It's like some genes wear multiple hats, influencing both our empathy and our tendency to systemize.
It's like this giant puzzle, figuring out how all these genes, our experiences, our brains come together to make us who we are. It's mind-boggling. But after all this talk about 0 degrees of empathy, the good and the bad, what are the main takeaways? What should we, the listeners, be thinking about?
That's a great question, and it leads us to the last part of the book where it talks about what it's actually like to live with 0 degrees of empathy. First thing it emphasizes is that 0 degrees of empathy isn't automatically a bad thing. It's just a different way of experiencing the world.
Right. It's about understanding, not judging.
Exactly. The book acknowledges that people with low empathy face challenges, especially in social situations where, like, reading emotional cues and responding appropriately can be tough. But it also highlights how much those zero-positive folks contribute, especially in jobs that need those amazing systemizing skills.
Like all those scientists and engineers and artists we talked about, their unique brains bring so much to the table.
Absolutely. The book argues for a more inclusive and understanding world, one that welcomes and celebrates the strengths of people all across that empathy spectrum.
It makes you realize that our ideas of good and evil might be too simplistic, especially when it comes to something as complicated as empathy.
For sure. The book shows that 0 degrees of empathy can lead to harm, definitely, but it can also lead to incredible talent and contributions. It makes us really look at human nature and avoid those black and white judgments.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. What about you? Anything in particular stand out?
I think what's most interesting is the idea that empathy itself isn't just one thing. It's more of a, spectrum with different levels and ways it shows up. So this brings up the question, where do you, the listener, fall on this spectrum? And how does that affect how you see the world and interact with others? Something to think about, right?
Absolutely. It reminds us that we all experience and express empathy differently, and understanding those differences is key to building a more compassionate and inclusive world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
I'm ready to keep going,
Yep.
but we'll take a quick break for now. Be back soon to explore even more about 0 degrees of empathy and what it all means. Stay with us.
Yeah, it really makes you realize that empathy is, multifaceted. We think we get it, but there's always more to learn.
Totally. Speaking of learning more, I'm still kind of blown away by that whole thing about empathy being linked to specific genes. It's one thing to talk about nature versus nurture, but to actually find those genetic connections, that's next level.
It's pretty amazing. Yeah. It's like we're finally figuring out what makes us tick. And the book really gets into the weeds on their research. It gets even more fascinating, actually.
Okay, I'm all ears. How did they even start to, unravel the genetics of something as complex as empathy?
Well, they went right to the source, DNA. They used this technique called genotyping to analyze the genes of a whole bunch of volunteers. It's like, imagine taking cheek swabs, getting the DNA, and then looking for variations in specific genes, like detective work, but, microscopic.
That's insane. But with, thousands of genes in our DNA, how do they even know where to start? Did they just pick random genes to study?
No, they had a plan. They focused on what they called candidate genes. These were genes that previous research had already kind of hinted at, genes that might be involved in empathy and social behavior and stuff like that, like narrowing down a list of suspects based on clues.
So they weren't just, throwing darts at a board.
Not at all. They had a strategy.
So what kind of genes made it onto their, suspect list?
One group was genes related to sex hormones, like testosterone and estrogen. That's because, there are often differences in empathy between men and women, with women usually scoring higher on those empathy tests.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hormones have a huge impact on us, for sure. Any other categories of genes they looked at?
Yep. They also looked at genes related to social emotional behavior. Remember that CNR1 gene we talked about? The one linked to how our brains respond to happy faces? Well, they figured that genes involved in those social reactions might also play a role in empathy.
It's like they were creating a genetic map of empathy, like pinpointing the spots that hold the secrets to how we connect with each other.
I like that analogy. They were basically piecing together the genetic building blocks of empathy, but they didn't stop there. They also included genes involved in, neural growth and development.
Why those genes? What's the connection to empathy?
Well, other studies had shown that the brains of people with autism, who often have trouble with empathy, sometimes have differences in how their neurons connect and how their brains developed early on. So they thought maybe these developmental genes were part of the empathy puzzle too.
It's amazing how they brought all these different areas of research together. But after all that work, did they actually find any, empathy genes?
Well, it's not that simple. Empathy is way too complex to be controlled by a single gene. But out of the 68 genes they tested, they found 4 that were significantly linked to scores on the empathy quotient.
Hold up. So there are genes that can influence how empathetic we are. That's huge. Which genes were they?
One of them, CYP-BL1B1, was part of that sex steroid group, which supports the idea that hormones are involved. Yeah. Another, WF-BASI, was in that social emotional behavior category, hinting at a link between our social responses and how empathetic we are.
What about the other 2?
Those were NTRK1 and JBRB3, both involved in neural growth and development. This basically means that the way our brains develop early on can have a lasting impact on our empathy.
So it's not just about the genes themselves, but how they shape our brains from the get-go.
Exactly. It's this super intricate dance between genes and brain development. But remember, they also use that autism spectrum quotient in their research. And they found 4 different genes associated with scores on the AQ, which means there's probably a genetic influence on autistic traits too.
So different sets of genes for empathy and autistic traits. Interesting. Did those findings overlap at all?
It gets even cooler. They also found 6 genes that were specifically associated with Asperger's syndrome. Some were from that sex steroid group, including CYP17A1, which is involved in, like, the menstrual cycle. Plus, they found the oxytocin gene, OXT, and a couple we've already talked about, ARNT1 and HOX1.
Okay, I'm trying to keep all these genes straight. But what's really sticking out to me is that one gene, CYP11B1, showed up in both the empathy findings and the Asperger syndrome findings.
That's a super important point. It suggests that some genes do double duty, influencing both our empathy and our tendency to systemize. It really shows how complex this whole system is.
It's like genes are conducting an orchestra in our brains, and the same instrument can play different tunes depending on the song. So what was the big takeaway for the authors after all this research?
They emphasize that genes are definitely part of the story, but they don't control our destiny. It's not as simple as, like, this gene equals this trait. It's way more nuanced. Our genes, environment, and individual experiences all interact.
So we're not just robots programmed by our genes.
Not at all. The book talks about a bunch of other things that can affect a person's empathy level. For example, babies who have problems during birth, like not getting enough oxygen, might be more likely to have behavioral problems later on, like aggression and low empathy.
That's really sad to think about. Those early moments can have such a big impact. What other factors did they mention?
They talked about physical things that can sometimes be signs of developmental issues, like low-set ears, which can happen for lots of reasons, can be a sign of potential problems. And if you combine that with a family environment that's, like, unstable or chaotic, it can increase the chances of a kid developing low empathy and maybe even being violent.
Like a perfect storm of biological vulnerabilities and environmental stress. It really shows how important support and early intervention are for families going through that.
I agree. The book even mentions a study from Denmark that found that boys who had both birth complications and were rejected by their mothers were way more likely to commit violent crimes as adults. It's a serious reminder of how powerful these forces are in our lives.
With all this talk about the different types of 0 degrees of empathy, I keep thinking back to those seropositive folks, especially those with Asperger syndrome. They have their own unique struggles, but they also have these incredible talents. It's kind of like 2 sides of the same coin, you know?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The book actually has a whole section dedicated to this systemizing mechanism in the brain. It's basically our ability to find and understand patterns, and it seems to be, like, supercharged in people with Asperger's syndrome.
So their brains are wired for pattern recognition. But how does that translate into all those amazing skills we talked about earlier?
Well, think about it. Systemizing is crucial for all sorts of stuff. Predicting the weather, figuring out how to use a new gadget, understanding complicated systems. It's all about seeing patterns, understanding how things work, and being able to guess what will happen next.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the book also said there are different levels of systemizing, right? Not everyone is equally good at picking up on patterns.
Exactly. They talk about a 7-level system, from level 0, where someone barely notices patterns at all, to level 6, which is where people with autism and Asperger's are thought to be. At that level, the drive to systemize is so strong that it affects everything they do.
Wow, so they're constantly looking for patterns in everything. That sounds both amazing and exhausting.
It can be. The book explains how this intense focus on patterns can make unexpected changes and unpredictable situations really stressful for them. Their whole world is about order and predictability.
Like they need a step-by-step guide for life, and any, deviation from the plan freaks them out.
Yeah, kinda. And the book argues that this need for precision and predictability, which comes from their systemizing brains, is what makes them less interested in the messy world of emotions. Emotions just don't follow the same rules as, say, math or science.
So it's not that they're choosing to be unemotional, it's just that their brains are prioritizing different things.
Exactly. And while this can definitely lead to social challenges, it also fuels those awesome talents we see in people with Asperger's. Their ability to hyper-focus on patterns lets them do incredible things in fields that need that laser focus.
Like they're seeing the world through a different lens, one that lets them notice things the rest of us miss.
Exactly. And the book makes a really good point. We owe a lot to these zero-positive individuals. Their innovations and ideas have made our lives better in so many ways.
It's a reminder that neurodiversity is a strength, not a weakness. We need all kinds of minds to make the world a better place. But there's something I've been wondering about. The book talks about the moral implications of 0 degrees of empathy, especially for the zero-positive folks. How do people with Asperger's develop a moral compass if they struggle with empathy?
That's a really great question, and it makes us think about how we define morality. The book suggests that for people with Asperger's, their strong sense of logic and justice is often the basis for their moral code.
So instead of feeling someone else's pain, they might arrive at moral conclusions through, like, a more rational process?
Exactly. They might think that harming others is wrong because it breaks a system of rules or principles. Their morality is based on fairness, consistency, and logic.
Like a morality based on universal laws instead of emotional empathy. That's really interesting.
It is, and the book says that people with Asperger's are often very strict about rules and can become strong advocates for justice when they see those rules being broken.
So they might not instinctively feel someone's pain, but they could be really bothered by injustice.
Exactly. The book even mentions research by James Blair, an expert on psychopathy, who found that people with autism often develop a normal sense of morality, even if their empathy is impaired.
Wow, that's amazing. So empathy isn't the only path to morality.
It seems not. It suggests that morality can come from different mental processes, like logic, reasoning, and a sense of fairness. We need to think more broadly about how moral decision-making works.
This is really making me rethink my own ideas about empathy and morality. It's so easy to put people in boxes of good and bad, but it's clearly much more complicated than that.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the most important things the book is trying to tell us. To move beyond simple judgments and embrace the complexity of human nature. We all have our own strengths and weaknesses and ways of experiencing the world.
Yeah, it really makes you realize that we all have so much to learn about ourselves and each other. And, even those differences that might seem, I don't know, difficult or strange at first, those can actually be like strengths. They can lead to incredible things.
I agree. Having different ways of thinking, different perspectives, even different ways of experiencing emotions, that's what makes humans so interesting.
This whole conversation about 0 degrees of empathy has like flipped my whole perspective. I used to think empathy was this simple thing. You either have it or you don't. But now I see it's this massive spectrum with all sorts of variations. It's complex.
It really is. And it's important to remember that even people who seem to lack empathy can still develop a strong moral compass. It might not be based on the same, emotional stuff as someone with a lot of empathy, but it can be just as strong in guiding their actions.
That's a really good point. It's so easy to judge people without really understanding what's going on inside, But this deep dive has shown me there's always more to the story.
Absolutely. And it's not just about understanding people who are at the extremes of the empathy spectrum. It's about realizing that everyone experiences and expresses empathy in their own way.
So even those of us who think we're pretty empathetic might still have areas where we could, I don't know, improve, like places where we could be more understanding.
Definitely. Empathy is a skill. And like any skill, you can practice it and get better.
That's actually really hopeful. So we're not stuck at one point on the empathy spectrum forever. We can actually work on becoming more compassionate.
Exactly. And the more we learn about the science behind it, the better we'll be able to make those changes.
That's a great point. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of 0 degrees of empathy, what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with? What should they be thinking about?
I'd say think about where you fall on that empathy spectrum. Where are you? And how does that affect your experiences, your relationships, how you see the world around you? It's a question worth asking, and you might be surprised by what you discover about yourself.
That's a great point. It's a reminder to look inward and think about our own capacity for empathy. And to remember that empathy isn't just about feeling what others feel. It's about understanding all the things that contribute to how we connect with and care for each other. Biology, psychology, our social experiences.
I like that. It really captures the complexity.
Well, this has been an amazing journey. Thank you for joining us as we explored the world of 0 degrees of empathy. The good, the bad, and all the science in between. Until next time, keep those minds curious.